Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Good evening. Dear guests, kindly make sure that your mobile phone are switched off or are set to silent mode. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of His Excellency Professor Jamal Sanad Al-Suwaidi, Director General of the Emirates Center for Strategic Studies and Research, we would like to welcome you this evening to a lecture titled The Evolution of the UAE Armed Forces and its Predecessor Forces from 1965 to 1980, to be delivered by Dr. Athol Yates. Dr. Yates, working in the Institute for International and Civil Security at Khalifa University, teaching security, disaster management, and public policy. He previously worked at the Australian Security Research Centre in Canberra, a think tank focusing on security issues in Australia. He has written 2 books on the UAE Armed Forces and is due to publish a 3rd book this year titled The Evolution of the UAE Armed Forces 1951 to 2019. The lecture will discuss the history of the armed forces in the UAE and how the late Sheik Zayed was able to build an advanced military within a span of 15 years, where the Abu Dhabi Defense Force had grown into one of the region's most capable militaries. Thus, following the merger of all armed forces in the UAE, the Abu Dhabi Force became the core of the UAE militaries. And now, I would like to welcome Dr. Yates to deliver his lecture. Please, sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good evening, honoured guests, ladies and gentlemen. Today, the UAE Armed Forces is probably the most capable Arab military. This is an amazing achievement given the nation's small population, its relatively small military, and the country's short history. However, what is even more impressive is the Armed Forces founding years, 1965 to 1980. We start in 1965 because this is a year in which a ruler established the first locally controlled military. This force was the Abu Dhabi Army, and it was established by Sheikh Zayed bin Zayed, Sheikh bin Sultan. At the end of Sheikh Zayed's reign in August 1966, this military consisted of just 158 men. 158 men. It's made up of 6 officers, 59 trained soldiers, with the rest being under training and support personnel. So this was the size and the quality of the military that Sheikh Zayed inherited when he became ruler of Abu Dhabi. At that time, when he became ruler, the only ruler-controlled security forces across the Emirates were the Abu Dhabi Police and the Dubai Police. These were relatively basic police forces of just several hundred men each and equipped primarily with rifles. However, within 15 years, the UAE had a modern land forces that fielded armoured vehicles, artillery, special forces and air defence. Its air forces consisted of ground attack aircraft, air superiority aircraft, transport and helicopters. Its navy consisted of 3 types of vessels: 40-foot, 56-foot and 110-foot patrol boats, and they were getting, in the late 70s, fast attack missile boats fitted with Exorcist surface skimming missiles. The UAE had also established a significant Emiri Guard made up of 3 elements: the plainclothes Special Guard, the uniformed Royal Guard, and a rapid response military force. The UAE, by 1980, had also participated in 2 foreign operations. It's well known that one of them was the Lebanese peacekeeping force, peacekeeping forces in Lebanon in 76 to 79, but little recognised is the very first overseas operation, which was the peacekeeping deployment to Oman in 1973 to 1975. My talk today is going to be about how Sheik Zayed achieved this amazing development of developing from virtually nothing within 15 years to what is a contemporary, for that time, modern, sophisticated force. Now, what's really significant about this achievement is the context in which he did it. He faced a large number of challenges. These included a limited population, a population with low literacy, education and technical skills, a lack of a professional military infrastructure here, which included a cadre of experienced officers and senior non-commissioned officers. He lacked all training establishments. He had no logistic support and no administration. Now, I don't have time in my 30 minutes that has been allocated to this talk to discuss all of those issues. However, I'm going to look at one just to illustrate the scale of the challenges that he faced. Before I do that, I need to explain a bit more of the context and the problems that he was facing, the geopolitical situation at the time. So, during the 1800s, the Emirates were protected states of Britain. That means that Britain was responsible for the external defence and the foreign relations of the Emirates, and the rulers were responsible for all internal decisions. So what this meant militarily is that Britain provided external defence in case a neighbour sought to invade, whether it was Iran, Qatar, Oman or Saudi Arabia. Consequently, during the British period, there was no great need for the rulers to develop a substantial military, simply because that was the responsibility of the British. However, this all changed in January 1968, where Britain unilaterally decided to end the treaties of protection that they had signed with each of the rulers of the Emirates. What this meant was that Britain would in 3 years' time, that is by 1971, would no longer be responsible for the external defence of the Emirates. So all of a sudden, the rulers were all faced with the fact that Britain would no longer be there and that they were at the mercy of larger or more aggressive neighbours. So within days of the British announcement, Sheikh Zayed ordered a plan to transform his military. What he needed was, what he demanded, that was that by the end of British departure in 1971, he would have expanded his battalion-sized force that was principally geared for patrolling and internal security. He wanted that to now be a brigade-sized, fully mechanised combat force with infantry, armour, artillery, plus wings for naval forces and wings for air forces. Now, to achieve this, what he needed to do was to expand the manpower of the force from around 600 in early 1968 to a massive 4,000 men by 1971, 3 years later. So the next slide will show you the problems he had just in terms of the manpower. What you're looking at here is the figures from the 1968 census, and you can see Abu Dhabi in Ireland itself, the city itself, had 22,000 people in it. Dubai, you can see the figures there. Ras Al Khaimah, quite small, and Fujairah, and so on. So a total of 180,000. Well, that sounds quite large, but just remember that at that time about half of them were expatriates. I'm going to show you that in the next slide. Right, what this shows you is Abu Dhabi's population by district in 1971. And some of the more interesting things to note there is that the population had doubled by that stage between those 3 years, between 68 and 71. The population had gone from 46,000 to 84,000. However, just 34% of the Abu Dhabi population was nationals, 34%. And if you look at just at males, there was only 16,000 nationals, and that includes boys and older people, older men who are outside military service period capabilities. And in areas that were critical to the defence of Abu Dhabi, such as Liwa, you had a massive number of 718 men, and in Bidr Zayed you had 94. So you can see the challenge he faced. He needed 4,000 men, and there was simply no way that Abu Dhabi nationals could provide the numbers that he required for a modern military. Now, before I start to answer the question of this talk, how did Sheik Zayed develop such a modern and capable armed forces by the 1980s, I want to give some background on my research. So for the last 7 years, I've been working on the history of the UAE military and police forces and produced 2 books, with one to be published later in the year. I wrote these primarily for my teaching at Khalifa University, where we take young, mid-career Emiratis who currently work in the security sector or related areas, and over a 2.5-year period, we educate them and they gain a Masters of Arts in International and Civil Security. Well, a key part of understanding the security environment of the UAE is to understand its history. So there was no books on this that was comprehensive that put it into the context. So this is why I published these books. Now, these could only have been possible with the assistance of many, and I'm just going to point to 2 of them that were very significant to this. So Major Sheikh Zayed bin Hamad, a young police officer who's extremely interested in history. He's been a great supporter of it. Major General Sheikh Zayed bin Hamdan, who's the commander of the UAE Navy, was also extremely supportive. I'm also very grateful for the time that the former commanders of various militaries have been able to give me. They've been most important. Now, what you will have noticed in all of those photos, there was a number of other people in those. Well, most of those were students who had been volunteered to help me on this research. One's in the photos, and I think a number of them are here today, and I want to give them recognition for their time and effort. People like Ahmed El-Graithi, Musaba El-Graithi, Khalid El-Shihi, Ahmed Kimis, Ahmed Al-Suwaidi, and some that aren't in there that certainly deserve mention because of their important research that has been fed into their masters. People like Reem El-Dahari, Fatima El-Kabaisi, Namin Kamba and Muhammad Al-Alama. I'm extremely grateful for their assistance. Another key source of information was from a lot of the old veterans. So I've been very fortunate in being able to obtain quite a few photos, and when I do, I try to identify those people who are still alive in them. And then what we do is we go and try to track them down. So this one was Robin Hitchcock, in about 1967. He was I think a captain at that time, and he was the founding commander of Abu Dhabi's 2nd Infantry Regiment. This is what he looks like today. And we tracked him down, interviewed him, and you'd be amazed at the number of historic materials that these guys had kept. This is us giving him the photo. Another chap we tracked down was Tim Cooper, who was the founding commander of the commandos that were the basis of today's Special Forces. That's what he looks like today. And he had, very interestingly, the working draft of the first Land Forces Doctrine from 1972. He was working on that there. Fascinating to have that material. There's also a number of local historians that are doing fabulous work in this area, like Dr. Saif El-Bawadi, And I also want to give recognition to other groups who have been very supportive, like the Museum and Military History Centre at the UAE Armed Forces, the UAE Archives in Abu Dhabi, ECSSR Library. If you haven't gone to the library, you should. It's a fabulous library, the Federation Library, and they've got some material there that I've not seen in other archives. And of course the British Archives. Now turning now to more on the military history per se, the structure of the Emirates, it's really quite complex, the early history before 1980. Suffice to note is that there are three types of military forces based on who controlled them, all coexisting simultaneously in the Emirates. The first was British-controlled forces from the period when they were responsible for security. Ruler-controlled forces, those controlled by the rulers, and then UAE-controlled ones, which are those controlled by the UAE government itself. So the British one, there was really only one force, which was the Trucial-Aman levies, which became known as the Trucial-Aman Scouts, renamed. There were 5 ruler-controlled forces: Abu Dhabi, Ras Al Khaimah, Dubai, Sharjah and Quwain. And there was 2 UAE-controlled forces: the Union Defense Force, which later became the Federal Armed Force, and the UAE Armed Force. Now, I don't want to go through the history of all of those because it's just too complex. What I'm doing is I'll show you a timeline that actually illustrates their evolution quite well. So the first force was formed in 1951, the British Trucial-Aman levies, and it was a force that was designed primarily for hinterland internal security purposes. So that is protecting the British diplomatic representative in the region as he travelled round, and providing hinterland security, such as capturing criminals that have fled to the regions outside of the towns, or stopping brigands. Town security was the responsibility of the rulers. In 1956, that became renamed as the Trucial-Aman Scouts. So when Britain left, they handed that entire force over to the UAE, and it became then the Union Defense Force. The Abu Dhabi Defense Force, as I mentioned, was formed in 1965. The Ras Al Khaimah Mobile Force was 1968, developed in direct response to Britain's announcement that it would depart. The Dubai Defence Force was formed just prior to Federation in 1970. Sharjah National Guard was formed after the rebellion in 1972 and the killing of Sheikh Khalid. And then the Quwain National Guard in 76. Now, there's 2 things you need to note about this. The first thing is that the Trucial-Aman Scouts, Levy Scouts, the British force, was the element within... I meant to show you this. So in 1976, all of these became merged to make the UAE Armed Forces. So what's significant in terms of the Trucial-Aman Scouts part of it is that they are the element of the force with the oldest pedigree. Absolutely true. However, in terms of the nucleus of the UAE Armed Forces, it was not the Trucial-Aman Scouts at all, or the Union Defence Force. It was the Abu Dhabi Defence Force. And you just have to look at it in terms of numbers. By 1976, when the Union Defence, when all the forces merged, the Union Defence Force had about 5,000 men at that stage. It was primarily a land force. This contrasts with the Abu Dhabi Defence Force, which had 15,000 men, so over 3 times as many. But more importantly, it had an air force of substance and a navy of substance. So in fact, it was the Abu Dhabi Defence Force that was the core, the nucleus of the UAE Armed Forces, not the Trucial-Aman Scouts, as a lot of history portrays it. So how did the UAE build such a modern force in 15 years? The most common answer to this, and certainly the most superficial, is Sheikh Zayed threw money at it. That is true to some degree. He was able to to spend a great deal on defence and buy the best equipment, and lots of it. And if you look at the graph of expenditure, this one is in US millions. So you can see it rose substantially in 73 onwards as a result of the oil embargo and the massive increase in revenues that Sheikh Zayed and the UAE received at that point. But also it was driven by the arms race initiated by Iran at that time under the Shah. However, money is not the solution. It's not the whole story to explain how he built such a large force. For if it was, Saudi Arabia would have had a much more significant force by 1980 than the UAE did, and it's arguable that they certainly were not as capable at that point, despite spending the greater amount, much larger amount of money. A far more important reason was the direct and personal involvement by the country's leadership in the military. Now, I'm going to use Sheikh Zayed as an illustration of this. This picture shows of Sheikh Zayed in 1953 alongside the British forces. During the 1952 to 1953, when the Bahraini crisis occurred following Saudi Arabia's move into parts of Bahrain, Sheikh Zayed had direct involvement with the British in the military operations that led to their eventual expulsion. He coordinated local forces, and he played an active role in the political military solution of that time. You'll also see lots of pictures of Sheikh Zayed involved in more ceremonial aspects of the military, such as reviewing a graduation parade, and he was obviously very keen in the military arts, such as shooting. You'll also see him involved in participating in firepower demonstrations, which were quite common, and he was involved in those to have a better understanding of the capability of his men and his forces at that time, because he could see them physically. He could see their numbers, what the vehicles could actually do, what the level of training of the individuals were. He took a direct involvement in deciding on what military equipment to buy. And this is possibly one of my most favourite pictures, down the bottom on the left, where you see Sheikh Zayed looking underneath a Scorpion light tank. And what he's looking at is the amount of clearance underneath the vehicle, because if there wasn't sufficient clearance, when it went over sand dunes, it would get stuck on top of them. His evaluation, which turned out right, was that they weren't suitable, hence Abu Dhabi never bought them. Some of the Northern Emirates obtained them though. He was also involved in selection of military bases. Now, those examples I've given you, I think, are somewhat superficial because they don't capture his actual direct hands-on involvement. And I'm going to give you an illustration of his actual substantive involvement in the development of the military. And that revolves around the purchase of this aircraft. This is a ground attack Hunter. It was a near supersonic jet, near supersonic jet, and its key role was to target ground vehicles. Now, remember, go back 1968, he had the problem that he needed a force to deter and stop any aggressive external force. Now, for that, your conventional approach is that you need to have a large amount of mechanised equipment, tanks, infantry, artillery, combat engineering. He was not going to be able to achieve that within 3 years. So what he decided to do, with the advice of his appointed Air Force personnel and his head of armed forces, was to go down the route of using aerial delivered artillery, which is in effect this aircraft. He could obtain these aircraft, obtain some foreign experienced pilots. He then was able to field a fully fledged ground attack capability within 2 years, and it was a substantive deterrent in itself, and it allowed time then for the ground forces to build up capability to develop a more comprehensive type of military deterrence. His personal involvement also established what the missions were to be of the UAE Armed Forces. And there are 5 missions, and these are the same missions that still drive the force development of the UAE today: defending territorial integrity and sovereignty, protecting the ruler and his family, bolstering internal security, contributing to nation building, and supporting foreign policy. So it's not only though Sheikh Zayed who was involved in this, because as the force grew larger, and the needs of developing Abu Dhabi and the UAE became greater, he could spend less time on it. So a common approach that we see across the Emirates is to have increased involvement in the military by senior sons of the ruler. So whether it was Sheikh Khalifa or Sheikh Sultan, whether it was Sheikh Mohammed at a very early age, you will see them increasingly being involved. You saw it also in the other Emirates. Now, what's really important to note, if you look at those areas where the rulers or their sons focused on, there was a rapid development of capability in those areas, which explains how come the Saladin squadron grew so rapidly in Dubai. You know, it went from nothing in 1970. They had no armoured vehicles, they had no trained personnel. Within a couple of years, they were able to field quite an experienced and fully equipped and trained force and I would contend that this is an example of where the rulers focused on an area, gave it a lot of attention, and you saw rapid change. However, conversely, when they started to look away, things somewhat deteriorated. Right, so that's 2 reasons. Another key reason was the willingness to spend on human capital development. And what you saw was the development of military boys' school. So this is a picture of the British Sultan Scouts, but there was a number of military boys' schools established in the late 60s and early 70s by each of the Emirates. He also spent and developed a large number of adult learning centres. These are absolutely critical in building up literacy skills, technical skills, managerial skills of people who did not have the opportunity to go to school in the 60s and the 1950s. At the same time as these general skills, he was also investing significant amounts of money and effort and focus on professional military education. So we saw the development in the early 1970s of the Zayed Military College. We saw a number of military schools being established, the infantry school, armour school, and so on. Now, these are often basic or technical skills. What you also saw him insist on is development of the officer corps. So these next 2 pictures show you the education that was being undertaken by senior officers of the Abu Dhabi Defense Force to the more junior officers. And these ones show you, if you can read the signs, yes. So it shows you, labels what the elements are, and they just physically move them around, and it showed you how to run tactical level operations. Okay, the final reason I would contend is how Sheikh Zayed was able to rapidly build the military over a 15-year period was that he engaged military professionals. These were experienced guys who he recruited, who were very loyal to them. He knew their quality before he engaged them. This is the senior leadership. And what you're looking at here is a picture in 1967 with the Sheikh Zayed shaking hands with the head of the Navy. And the short guy there is the commander of the Abu Dhabi Defense Force. The chap to his left is the deputy commander, and the chap on the far right is the head of the Air Force. Now, what's important to note is that the head of the Abu Dhabi Defense Force and his deputy commander had worked with Sheikh Zayed in the 1960s, and in the case of the deputy commander, he worked with Sheikh Zayed during the Bahraini dispute in 1954-55. He was a senior person at that point, and he built up a great deal of trust with Sheikh Zayed, and then Sheikh Zayed asked for him personally to be seconded back to work for him in the early, from 1966 onwards. So what we saw in the early years was the expatriates setting up the systems, establishing the forces very rapidly and commanding them. However, they knew they had a life expectancy of traditionally 3 to 4 years. They were told by the very top leadership, you have 3 years, 4 years to transfer your knowledge. You need to train young Emirati officers, build up their skills, and then they will replace you. Then in general, what happened was that those guys would then become advisors for another year or so and then leave the country. So what you saw was an order by Sheikh Khalifa and Sheik Zayed in the early 70s, first for the Arabization of the military and then full Emiratisation starting at about 73 onwards. So by 1975, most of the British had left. The Abu Dhabi Defense Force. Dubai kept them on for longer, and after that you saw increasingly numbers of young Emirati officers heading up military units, and though it would take to about 1983 and 4 before all of the heads of the UAE Armed Forces military branches, Air Force, Land Forces and Navy, were headed up by Emiratis. What you'll notice that this process still continues today, and it's, I think, one of the keys in developing any capability is getting in people with the expertise for a small number of years, telling them they have a short life expectancy, your role is to transfer that knowledge, and that generally seems to work quite well. So, in conclusion, I would contend that there are 4 key reasons for how Sheikh Zayed was able to build up such a modern force. Large equipment expenditures, the direct personal involvement, human capital development, and engaging foreign military professionals. Now, I conclude that a number of the other Gulf states also adopted most of these approaches. But I would also contend by 1980, the UAE had achieved a far greater outcome, more capable militaries than the others had. And a key reason for that, I think, would have been this early years, the establishment of the need for rigorous, realistic and frequent training, was joint training. They introduced merit-based promotion, and they had a very structured program of transferring knowledge. That is primarily achieved through Sheikh Zayed's direct involvement in the country's military in those early years. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Yates, for such an informative and interesting lecture in which you described the UAE Armed Forces during its early days and following the historic decision of its unification and Sheikh Zayed's pivotal role in management these efforts, which further consolidated stability in the UAE, where the armed forces have become a major sample of the UAE's progress. And now, we open the floor for the question and answer session. I kindly ask that whoever wishes to ask a question or provide comment, that they stand up and introduce themselves and keep their questions brief to allow other members of the audience to participate. Please.
كل الشكر على هذه المعلومات القيمة التي تشكل لنا كباحثين قيمة مضافة. سيكون طرحي ليس على شكل سؤال سيدي، وإنما على شكل إضافة بناء على الأربع نقاط اللي أشرت إلها في بناء القوات المسلحة الإماراتية. أشرت إلى النفقات، وهذا مطلب وطني لكل الجيوش تحتاج إلى هذا البعد. أشرت إلى دور القادة. أشرت إلى نقطة واللي هي أنا بحب أضيف عليها لتضيفها على محاضراتك القادمة، رأس المال البشري. والنقطة الأخيرة اللي أشرت إليها اللي هو اكتساب الخبرات الأجنبية. ما أريد أضيف سيدي إذا سمحت، من خلال أنا وجودي في دولة الإمارات كباحث استراتيجي، هناك نوعان من رأس المال: رأس المال البشري اللي أضفته، وهناك رأس المال النفسي. رأس المال النفسي هو من أهم عناصر القوة الوطنية لأي دولة. وعندما أقول رأس المال النفسي يرتكز كلامي على 4 نقاط كما أشرت. النقطة الأولى رأس المال النفسي الذي يرتكز على الأمل، النقطة الأولى، والتفاؤل النقطة الثانية، والكفاءة الذاتية النقطة الثالثة، والنقطة الرابعة هي المرونة النفسية. وهذا ما لمسته من خلال القيادة الحكيمة والرشيدة، تركز على تعزيز رأس المال النفسي. بدون رأس مال نفسي لا تستطيع أن تبني لا دولة ولا جيش. وهذا ما أريد أن تأخذوا بعين الاعتبار، أن رأس المال النفسي هو أحد عناصر القوة الوطنية التي نفتخر بها في دولة الإمارات. كل الشكر سيد.
السلام عليكم. قاسم سلامة من سوريا. الشكر لكم، بارك الله فيكم. إنما أتساءل، هل هناك دور للتعاون العربي مثل دولة الأردن، المملكة الأردنية مع دولة الإمارات أو أبو ظبي في بناء جيش الإمارات؟ وهل غفلتم عن هذا أم لم يكن هناك تعاون؟ شكرا.
رحمة الله وبركاته. أنا عقيد ركن متقاعد، قائد سلاح الهندسة من سنة 1990 إلى سنة 2000. طبعا نشكر المحاضر على كلامه وعلى توضيحاته، صراحة يعني وضح أشياء كثيرة يعني، بس كل هذا يرجع لفضل القيادة الحكيمة أولا وأخيرا. يعني المرحوم الشيخ زايد الله يرحمه كان سباق في دعم القوات المسلحة، بالعكس وزيارتهم دائما أولا بأول يعني، وأعطاهم المزيد من الخبرة. لما أرسلهم قوات الردع في لبنان في السبعينات اكتسبوا خبرة كثيرة في الأمور هذه. بعدين أولاده من صاحب السمو رئيس الدولة حفظه الله، والمرحوم الشيخ سلطان بن زايد القائد العام، وحاليا سمو ولي العهد، كلهم متابعين الأمور هذه القوات المسلحة، وأنا أساسا عشتها في الأمور هذه يعني. فهذه التدخل القيادة ومساعدتها ودفعها خلى جيشنا الحمد لله حاليا من أفضل الجيوش على مستوى العالم تقنية وإعدادا يعني. فالشكر للمحاضر على التوضيح هذا يعني.
When the UAE Armed Forces were stood up, the UAE was in large part a poor country, and the UAE is now in many ways a very rich country. What impacts, positive and negative, has that had on maintaining the quality of the UAE Armed Forces?
Thank you for your presentation. Very interesting. My name is Philip Parker. The next step is to inculcate a culture of jointness and joint warfighting for the UAE Armed Forces so they can take advantage of all the capabilities of the services. It took the U.S. military many years, many failures, and in fact a congressional mandate before they embraced jointness. So what is the path for the UAE to take this next important modernization step for their military?
Thank you for the questions. Brigadier, I thank you, and thank you for raising this issue about the psychological dimension and the importance of the physical presence of the leadership and passing on, sharing their knowledge and their spirit for positiveness, hope, and importantly resilience. I didn't really cover that point. When I was talking about human capital, I was talking more about the technical skills of that, but what you've said is absolutely right. And I would see another thing that was very important in the use of the military in the early years, which was to develop a national identity where people linked themselves or saw themselves as UAE citizens and not members of a particular tribe or members of an individual emirate. And when you talk to a lot of the former people who were involved in the early years, they reference this continually, such as trying to recruit more members from the Northern Emirates into the Abu Dhabi Defense Force in the lead up or to help push support for federation in 1971. Your question, sir, about Jordan. I neglected them in the talk, but in the publications and my research, I certainly identify the contribution that Jordanians, Pakistan, Sudan, and a number of other countries have made. I've even tracked down, I went to Jordan to interview some of the former Jordanian members of the security services who worked here. I didn't meet any of the former military personnel, but I was very fortunate to meet the head of the Jordanian mission that came here in 1967 to develop the police force. So Jordan was much more very important in developing the technical skills of the Abu Dhabi police force 1967 onwards. That mission only withdrew, I think, in 1979, something about that period. Now, the two gentlemen also asked questions about the positive and negative of today's military, given the development of the economic development and the social development of the country. Well, I think, and Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed himself and others have identified some of the challenges that comes with affluence. And I think if you look at the national service, that's part way trying to address those sorts of issues. And I think as we move forward and we see a greater national identity, I think we will see the armed forces gaining greater respect and it being used to make young men and ladies become more, what would you say, more positive towards work, fitter, living more healthy lifestyle, making a greater contribution for the nation rather than yourself. And hopefully it will reverse some of the things that is common in other countries, which is the focus on yourself and your personal dimensions. The question about jointness is an incredibly challenging problem, and I would contend that, as we've seen in the past, major developments occur, whether it's in doctrine or establishment of new forces, new capabilities. A lot of that comes down to from the direct engagement and the direct oversight by the leadership. So you need, I would argue that the focus on jointness will occur when the leadership sees that as a priority and drives it closely. Now, there's an opportunity cost of that, so that always, because the leadership has limited time.
At the end of today's lecture, and on behalf of His Excellency Professor Jamal Sanad Suwaidi, we would like to once again thank Dr. Yates, as well as the member of our audience for their participation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.